As I say, you're all very welcome. Good afternoon to the CNME. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Anne Gallen. I'm the Director of the Nursing and Midwifery Planning and Development Unit, which is based in Ballyshannon, covering Donegal, Sligo, Leitrim and part of West Cavan. So on behalf of the Nursing and Midwifery Planning and Development Unit, on behalf of our two centres for nursing and midwifery education, the one here in Letterkenny and the one in Sligo, and also on behalf of the All-Ireland Gerontological Nurses Association, I welcome you to this presentation and masterclass. I'm also delighted to share with you that Brendan and his team and the Institute of Nursing and Health Research and the University of Ulster have been formally collaborating with the Nursing and Midwifery Planning and Development Unit here in the North West for the last 8 months. And the purpose of that collaboration is so that we will build a strategic framework for the professions of nursing and midwifery here in the border regions of the North West. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Professor Brendan McCormack.
Good afternoon, the Masterclass. So thank you very much, Anne, for the welcome, and it's great to be here. Although we've been working together for the last 8 months, and I've been working with Randall for much longer than that, and with Liz, wherever she's disappeared to. Actually, I've not been here before, so it's really good to have the opportunity. As Liz said earlier, I normally pass through on my way to Downings or somewhere, so that's been the norm. So it is really good that we've been able to have this masterclass, and as part of the collaboration between ourselves and the NMPDU here in the North West, and I'm delighted that we actually have this time together. I'm also here in my role as President of AGNA, which is the All-Ireland Gerontological Nurses Association, because we've decided to kind of join forces in relation to that, and you'll see a flyer on your chair and also an application form if you're interested in joining up and being part of that. I've got a summer cold. I've managed to get through the whole winter without having any flus or colds, and then I went to the AGNA conference in Dundalk last week and came back with a cold, so whatever that's about, I don't know, but I'm trying to get through it without any pain. So what I want to do in this first hour really is just go through the whole issue of the Francis Report, but in the context of what it is, the kind of lessons that it gives to us, and the kind of things that we need to be thinking about in relation to person-centeredness, and then how practice development helps us to address that. Because one of the, I think, intriguing things for me since Francis reported has been this kind of awakening that culture is important, as if somehow it's being invented. And, you know, lots of comments about what we don't know how to change culture, and it's too hard, and we have to do these particular management things, which is all quite bemusing, really, for those of us who've been working with clinicians and working in clinical settings for many years, essentially changing culture. So I think there's an interesting dialogue going on. And if nothing else, for the first time ever, I have sat in conferences or shared conference platforms with chief executives of trusts and other healthcare organisations who now talk about compassion, when previously they mainly talked about targets and financial burdens. So it's quite interesting, the kind of shift that has resulted from this kind of one major scandal. So I'm going to firstly talk a bit about Francis and what it was about. Has everybody heard of it to begin with? Is that, yeah, okay. I guess you probably wouldn't be in the room if you weren't, you'd be going, what the hell is that about? So the fact that it is such a significant event, I think, is quite important. And then I'm going to weave that into what that means in the context of person-centeredness, practice development, and then some examples of how I think it can be made real every day without it being something magical, which is often how it's held up, really. Said about AGNA. Francis, I think, exists in a context that, in my view, a lot of practitioners in particular are kind of closing their eyes to, which is that the healthcare landscape has changed out of all recognition. I started as a nurse in 1980, and you know, there is no real resemblance to the healthcare landscape now to how it was then. It's just a very, very different healthcare world we're living in, as is the world generally. And you know, when people try and go back to those days as somehow the good old days, I remind them about the kind of abuse that was ignored in our various hospitals, because you know, some of the things that I saw my colleagues do to patients then would now be considered as gross misconduct and abuse, but because nobody really knew about it, then it never got mentioned. So there's a much more openness around healthcare. But secondly, the settings in which healthcare is delivered have changed out of all recognition. When I was a charge nurse in an acute medical ward, I mean, we knew we would have, out of a 30-bedded ward, at least 10 patients who were pretty self-caring. And because they were self-caring, then they often cared for other patients. They did things, on that ward. That is not the case in any of our acute wards now. It's lucky if you have one who is self-caring. And they're just, I think, two extreme examples of how the whole landscape has changed quite dramatically. And where we're heading for is really one of patient self-management, one in which we're not the arbiters of knowledge, we're not the holders of power and control over people's lives in healthcare, but actually we're essentially coaches and facilitators of people's healthcare experiences. And I'm not convinced, actually, that particularly in nursing we've really woken up to that. I think some branches of nursing have, but I'm not convinced that all of it has. And essentially what we're shifting to is one that's much more about individualism. We could hate Maggie Thatcher if we like, or we can love what she did around balancing things out. But that whole Thatcherite ideal in the UK, which is now promulgated around the world, it's about the individual and the individual taking responsibility for their health, is very, very much alive and well in most Western worlds in terms of healthcare planning and healthcare delivery. And if that is the case, then we have to shift with it in terms of what our role is. And when we start to look at Francis, you can start to see that actually there's a huge mismatch between some of that journey that was going on, particularly around partnership in decision making. The big agendas in health and social care, as Anne has already said, top of the list is safety. Now that we could do a whole masterclass on that in itself in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of focusing just on safety. I prefer to focus on safer because I think it's more about a journey rather than some kind of destination. The issue around the quality of the experience, I think, is something that has become much more prominent, and we see that now in much more data collection around patient stories, capturing patient voice, family experience, rather than just kind of bland satisfaction notions, but just trying to get at the experience more. Huge focus on staff competence, but equally on staff well-being. So my early message, of course, is that Francis would never have happened if staff were looked after, fundamentally. But what you had was actually a culture of abuse from the top to the bottom. And what we do know is that an organisation in which staff are well looked after is an organisation where they are more likely to give person-centred care. If staff don't feel that sense of being cared for as a person themselves, don't feel a sense of well-being, then they won't deliver it in terms of patient care. And that's well known, and some evidence to demonstrate that being the case. And so that whole movement that's around currently around mindfulness and creating quiet and all of that stuff is part of that whole ethos and culture of trying to create a different space in which people can work. And of course, the big focus is on person-centred outcomes. And whether they're as deliberate as some of the ones that I'll show you, or whether they're more implicit in the way that organisations describe the outcomes they're looking for, they are still about trying to get the best possible deal for the patient as a person. And that's fundamentally what we're about. And no matter what our profession, no matter what it is that we see ourselves as delivering, fundamentally, healthcare is focused on those four things at the moment, and they are the big agendas, and everything else slips in behind them. So, if you take that that's what the kind of big agendas are, and then we take the Mid-Staffordshire Report. Those of you who don't know, Mid-Staffordshire is an area in the middle of England, kind of Stoke-on-Trent kind of area, Midlands, and it's predominantly kind of a rural area, a very working class area, with Stoke-on-Trent as the big city kind of in the middle of it. And interestingly, I mean, the Francis Report, as it's referred to now, because it was Lord Francis who held and led the inquiry, the issue has been going on since about 2008, so it's not as if it was suddenly appeared in 2011. The whole situation at Mid-Staffordshire Trust started probably 2007, when questions started to be asked. And there was an early inquiry in 2009, and then that didn't seem to solve things, and then it got even worse, actually, which led to the Francis inquiry starting in 2011. So it's not been an overnight kind of event. It's something that built up over time and had been on the radar of many people for quite some time. if you want to read the Francis Report, I suggest firstly you take a week off and you buy a large bottle of gin and you disappear somewhere to kind of indulge in it for a while, because it is a huge tome to get through. If you click on it on the web and decide to print it, your printer will die. It's massive, and it actually consists of 2 reports. So it officially is the Francis Reports, because there are 2 of them. But there is a very good executive summary also on various places on the web that gives kind of the meat of what it is you need to pay attention to. So what went wrong in mid-staff? Well, the answer to that is everything. You know, if you wanted to kind of put it all together in one place, then here you got it. If you wanted every aspect of bad organisation, bad practice, bad leadership, bad management, bad attention to patient care, bad nursing, bad attention to relatives, it's all there in the one place. So it became a melting pot, really, of all of these issues that if you have 1 or 2 of them going on in your organisation, you'd be a bit worried. But to have all of them in the one place is pretty profound, and hence the reason why it has been such a major scandal. Interestingly, some of you may have remembered back in the late 90s, maybe 2000, what was the Bristol Hospitals Inquiry, which was then seen as the most major scandal to hit British healthcare, and you know, the likes of it could never be allowed to happen. And of course, 13 years later, it has re-happened in a different kind of way. But the fundamental issues at Staffordshire were that, care became so bad. There are stories, if you go to the full report, there are stories of people having to drink the water from the flower vases. They were so thirsty, and they were so dehydrated. There were stories of cannulas being encrusted in people's arms, that they needed intervention in order to be taken out because they were so encrusted into their veins. There were stories of people lying on floors in their own excrement for hours and sometimes days on end. There were stories of patient safety issues that would make your hair curl in terms of hygiene and cleanliness and infection control. And stories of relatives being so distressed that they, in the end, were unable to visit their relatives. They were so distressed by what they were seeing, which is a shocking state, in a sense, for anyone to get to. The culture at the time in this trust was one where they were going for foundation trust status. And I don't know if you know about foundation trust status, but in the UK, there is this opportunity for healthcare trusts to become foundation trusts. And foundation trust essentially means that you're almost an autonomous organisation. So you make all your own decisions about finance and about the way the organisation is structured. In the previous model, prior to the current reform, trusts were largely shaped by the way the government and the health boards and regions determined how services wanted to look. But as a foundation trust, you were almost autonomous. So it was this kind of borderline private issue, really, in that they were publicly funded but were very autonomous. And Midstaffs wanted to be a foundation trust and did achieve that. So their focus became achieving the government targets in order to achieve foundation trust status. And they are largely financial targets. So they have to show that they are financially prudent, that they are, have the leanest and meanest organisation in place, and they're assessed by various kind of regulatory bodies in order to do that. But in the process of doing that, they absolutely neglected the patient experience. They completely, as if that didn't matter to their foundation trust status. So whilst nursing, rightly, has come in for a complete hammering, I knew there would be a little more at some point. It's sunny and the window's open. While nursing came in for a complete hammering, and absolutely rightly, there are various examples in the report of where nursing and nurses tried to complain. And of course, because they complained, then they were disciplined, because there was a whole kind of whistleblowing policy. And what that encouraged was a culture of keep your mouth shut. So in the end, the nursing staff no longer complained, but they just kind of became more and more neglectful in the way